Hello and welcome back to History Foxy. In today's video, we will be talking about Queen Charlotte. She had been overlooked for the longest time, but Netflix series Bridgerton has brought her back into the public eye. Let's find out more about her. Sophie Charlotte, Duchess of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, was born on the 19th of May 1744 in Miro, Germany, as the youngest daughter of Duke Charles Louis Frederick of Mecklenburg, Prince of Miro, and his wife, Princess Elizabeth Albertine of Saxe-Hildburghausen. Charlotte was raised at the court in Miro, where her parents led a fairly happy marriage, which allowed the children to have a fulfilling childhood. Their home life was not dictated by etiquette, as a homely atmosphere was preferred by the Duke and Duchess. While the sons of the family received a broad education, the girls were handed more basic tuition that focused on making them modest, suitable brides one day. Charlotte was said to be a sensitive, charming little girl. While she wasn't too interested in most of her lectures, she enjoyed studying arts and botanics from an early age on. Her mother, Elizabeth, was a fairly religious woman and made the children read from the Bible daily, a habit Charlotte preserved all her life. Her father Charles died when Charlotte was 12 years old. Consequently, her brother succeeded to the dukedom. Finally, the young Duchess was able to participate in court life and eventually grew accustomed to courtly customs and duties. When Charlotte came of age, it was time to look out for a suitable husband. In 1760, the 22-year-old George III succeeded his grandfather on the English throne and desperately needed a queen and an heir. Charlotte was considered as one of the candidates since she was a Protestant and reportedly had no political ambitions. King George was delighted to hear that Charlotte was of a pleasant nature and sweet-tempered, as he desired no political interference from his wife. Eventually, Charlotte was the chosen one, an inexperienced, sheltered teen who was about to become queen of a kingdom she had never visited and marrying a man whom she had never met. After a proxy wedding ceremony was held in Mecklenburg, Charlotte set sail for England in 1761. She arrived at Harwich on the south coast in September, where she was welcomed by massive crowds which lined the route to St. James's Palace. Charlotte was shaken from nervousness as everyone tried to get a glimpse at the new queen. It is reported that she stumbled from a carriage towards the waiting King George, and as she went on to throw herself at George's feet, he caught her and welcomed his bride warmly. Lord Harcourt, who had accompanied Charlotte to England, described the young woman as having very pretty eyes, even though she was of no regular beauty, though she had her charms with even and white teeth. The days leading up to the wedding ceremony were packed with official events and receptions. From dining with the royal family to meeting courtiers and wedding dress fittings, Charlotte couldn't catch a break. On the day of the wedding, Charlotte stunned everyone with her lavish dress and the piles of jewels she was wearing. Her dearest piece of jewelry was a diamond ring which George had given her upon her arrival in England. After the wedding, the newlyweds settled into their home St. James's Palace, but oftentimes they would reside at Buckingham House, where the couple could flee from all the ceremonial and instead settle into a domestic home life. Charlotte spent hours studying English every day, greatly encouraged by her husband. The couple entertained courtiers by giving musical concerts and plays, but otherwise their court life was held very modestly. In the beginning of her marriage, Charlotte's mother-in-law Augusta monitored the new queen's consort every move, which gave Charlotte a hard time settling into her new home. After 1 year of marriage, Charlotte gave birth to the first son, George. For the next 20 years, she would give birth to a child almost every year, resulting in 15 children, of which 13 reached adulthood. Queen Charlotte's life was dominated by taking care of the children. The royal couple spent time with their children on a daily basis, which included playing games but also testing them on what they learned in their daily lessons. Charlotte took the education of her children very seriously and was in charge of choosing each tutor and governess. The children had a caring childhood, and especially their mother would stay involved in all of her offspring's lives later on, even though this wouldn't benefit all of them, especially when it came to her daughters. Charlotte was fond of keeping up traditions. For example, she made her female courtiers keep on wearing outdated court dresses and had the compliance with the court rules monitored at all times. Even though the royal couple was fairly young, they gained their reputation for stuffiness early on. Over time, Charlotte would adapt more to the British court, and eventually she realized the necessity of keeping the courtiers sympathetically. Despite their initial disfavor of pomp, Charlotte and George's court came to light. Besides their weekly musical concert and entertainments, they hosted levees every week. Famous artists such as Mozart and Handel went in and out at the British court, and on Thursdays and Sundays, the king and queen welcomed courtiers and diplomats. During these audiences, everyone showed off their wealth, and so did the royal family. But after the show was over, George and Charlotte enjoyed retreating into their more simple domestic life. As she was fond of gardening from early on, she took it upon herself to coordinate the creation of gardens, cottages, and menageries. Charlotte was keen to turn her palaces, including Windsor and Kew, into comfortable homes for her family. While Charlotte had a hard time socializing at the British court in the beginning, she had established a small inner circle whom she trusted deeply. As her husband had warned her to stay away from flatterers, Charlotte didn't allow many people into her circle, but once someone gained her sympathy, like her most trusted ladies-in-waiting, they were treated as old friends with whom she had devoted bonds that lasted for decades. Life for Charlotte seemed to be going great. She was in a loving, devoted marriage, which was unusual for her time and position. She had many healthy children, so the line of succession was secured, and thus her position as queen was secure. Tragically, her happiness would come crashing down after 27 years of marriage, when her husband George experienced his first episode of mental illness in 1788. Which was called madness back then, is now considered to have been either symptoms of porphyria or more likely a case of mental illness. New researchers which have analyzed letters of King George he wrote during his episodes suspect him having a manic phase, which were maybe linked to a severe case of bipolar disorder. George's symptoms included insomnia and violent outbursts, during which he often made unfounded accusations of adultery against Charlotte and troubled those around him with lewd comments. Charlotte, who didn't recognize her caring husband, suffered greatly under his outbursts. She stopped eating and slept only a few hours a night, always waiting another one of her husband's tempers. Soon, her worries became physically visible as the queen started to tear at her hair, which became grey prematurely. With her husband being this unstable, his ability to rule would soon come into question. Charlotte spent hours pacing back and forth, contemplating what would become of her and her situation. As George's behavior grew more violent over time, Charlotte feared for her and her children's safety. She began locking her bedroom door and kept her youngest children in her chambers at night, afraid for their well-being. After George physically assaulted his adult son, the Prince of Wales, nerves were on edge. Suitable treatments for mental illness were mostly unknown in that era, so the court physicians failed to treat the king properly. Charlotte was desperate. Eventually, she appointed Dr. Francis Willis, who was said to have cured the madness of a courtier. The procedures that would be performed by him were outrageous and unhelpful, to say the least. Arsenic-based powders were applied to the king's skin, causing it to blister. He was forced to fast, locked up, forced to sleep, bled, and given freezing cold baths as a way of shocking the illness from his body. Predatives were used to treat his constipation and cause diarrhea. During George's manic phases, he was often confined with a straitjacket, completely undermining his needs. Willis' treatment of the king has been well documented, but Charlotte was suffering alongside her husband. George had been her closest friend for decades, and his illness seemed to have taken him away from her. Even though George experienced better phases during his illness, he was mostly excluded from ruling. The formerly unpolitical Charlotte was now forced into parliamentary arguments over who should rule as regent during the king's illness. Her son, the Prince of Wales, was suggested as regent in 1789, which Charlotte refused to comply to. This led to great estrangement between mother and son, which would last for years. As George seemed to recover, the bill to put a regent in his place was discarded. Though her husband appeared to be getting better, Charlotte seemed to be traumatized, and her demeanor had been forever changed. She began to suffer from depression and develop a furious temper, often directed against her daughters. Charlotte relied heavily on her girls, and she didn't want to let them go, and neither did George. Of their 6 daughters, only 3 were married, and all of these marriages were formed in their 30s and 40s, which was ancient back then. There are different opinions circling on why the royal couple didn't have their daughters married off, as political advantageous bonds with the royal houses were usually formed that way. Some historians have come to the conclusion that the king was unwilling to let his daughters go, and when in a state of mania, he wasn't able to arrange them. Charlotte, on the other hand, is accused of forcing her daughters to be her companions when her husband was put away. The girls were sheltered from socializing with many people, especially outside of the royal court. There were enough proposals for marriage for all daughters, which were frequently turned down. The daughters were kept away from men in general and spent most of their time with her family. Eventually, they would complain about the dullness of their life, which Princess Sophia would compare to living in a nunnery. Even though the girls were monitored closely, they received their own house state when coming of age. This is when affairs and illegitimate children happened, but this would honestly take a whole nother video to elaborate on. From 1800 on, Charlotte had to take on responsibilities of ruling every now and then, as George slipped in and out of his episodes. Following the traumatic events she endured, Charlotte became extremely sensitive to every little change in her husband's behavior. At the merest hint of George becoming ill again, she had her bedroom doors locked and declined visiting her husband by herself. Even though she suffered greatly under George's symptoms, she was still protective of him and loved him dearly. In 1810, George had another severe mental breakdown from which he wouldn't recover. Consequently, his son, George, Prince of Wales, came to power as Prince Regent in 1811. Charlotte's main focus, besides assisting her son as regent, was the guardianship of her husband. The years of suffering had worn her down, and the once good-spirited queen had grown hard. For the last decade of his life, the king was secluded at Windsor, where Charlotte oversaw his care and had to watch him fade away until he no longer recognized her and even turned blind. Charlotte was left distraught by visiting her husband, who often cursed at her and accused her of loving her dogs more than him, before he eventually couldn't talk at all anymore. The Queen's last public appearance was in London in April 1818, after which she fell severely ill. Unable to walk, Charlotte was confined to her bed for her remaining days. On November 17, 1818, Queen Charlotte died in her bed surrounded by her children. Her husband George would follow her in 1820 and was laid to rest beside her. Queen Charlotte seemed to have been mostly overlooked until recently, as she is viewed as mostly an unpolitical queen without much influence. Most of you probably watched or have heard about the Netflix series Bridgerton, which has shed some light on Charlotte again. So far, Charlotte was mostly remembered for being the wife of a mad king and for bringing the Christmas tree to England. Nowadays, she's more talked about for the question of her heritage. Historian Mario de Valdes y Cocom claims that he traced Charlotte's genealogy back through 9 generations to Margarita de Castro e Sousa, a 15th century Portuguese noblewoman whom he postulates as black. Valdez's research has been disputed by some historians, who argue that the 9 generations that divide Margarita and Charlotte render such connections moot. Some also suggest that Valdez has misinterpreted the historical evidence regarding Margarita's ethnicity, which has implications for his theories regarding Charlotte's heritage too. Nevertheless, it's a subject that will no doubt continue to fascinate.